I just started the recording. Good to go.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm Tony DeFranco, Director of Operations for SUNY OER Services. I just wanted to give a little background on our partnership with Lumen Learning, which began in 2012, and I've been fortunate enough to be part of this since the very beginning. Our mission is to enhance college affordability, student success, and by promoting OER and evidence-based courseware, really we're aiming to transform teaching in the learning process across the SUNY system. And out of the 64 campuses, we're supporting 59 of them. We focus on improving OER infrastructure, ensure high quality resources are available where they're most needed. And of course, we do that with the help of our partners, in particular Lumen Learning. Together, we support faculty development and student achievement through innovative, accessible educational tools. At this time, I'd like to introduce someone we've had the pleasure of working closely with through the partnership, Tori Matthews. He's the Senior Executive Director of Partnerships at Lumen and a former SUNY faculty member. Tori's extensive experience and deep commitment to open education have really helped drive impactful OER initiatives across the SUNY system. Tori.
Thank you, Tony. It's great to meet all of you. I think from the names I'm saying, I know some of you. If we haven't met before, I want to take this opportunity to share my contact information, one. So I'm going to put it up on the screen. Share it here. I thought I was sharing it here. Okay. Looks like I am. Can everyone see? Okay.
We're good.
So I have the great pleasure of working at the intersection of the SUNY Lumen partnership. I am the Senior Executive Director of Partnerships, and I have the great honor of working with our SUNY faculty specifically. So I wanted to give my name and let you know that if you have any questions about how the partnership can serve you, your institution, your students, if you have any questions about anything that's offered through the partnership, so there's a host of courseware through Lumen Learning and online learning initiatives that is completely free of cost to you and your students. It's covered by SUNY OER services. There is professional development through Lumen Circles. If you have any questions after this talk, you can either reach out to Tony. If you have any questions for David, I always like to share my email because it's real simple, Tori@lumenlearning.com. Right, that seems to go over well. People remember TORI and they remember lumenlearning.com. So if you don't remember anything else about what I'm saying, if you remember that email address, if you ever have any questions about the partnership, we would love to work with you. If you're thinking about ways that you can cut costs for your students and still give them a quality product, if you're thinking about any initiatives that you have on campus, faculty, professional development, please reach out to me. And I know you came to listen to David, and his thoughts on where OER and AI are going to intersect in the future. So I will turn it over to him now.
Thanks, Tori. All right, and I will share my screen. I believe everyone can see that. Yep. So this is a topic I've been thinking and writing and talking about for several months now. And I think there's still so much that's unknown about how things are going to change, but I want to maybe not give some specifics, but give some directions in which I think things are going to move. I'll suggest a couple of things. This presentation, of course, is an OER itself. I can share the link to it after. Quick run through of where we're going to go. I want to talk about the origins and goals of the modern open ed movement. The most powerful emerging technology, talk specifically about the impact of generative AI on traditional OER, and I'll contrast traditional OER with what I'll call generative OER, talk about how those might impact our pedagogies. We might do some objections and criticisms, and then I'll wrap up with concluding thoughts. So let me start with goals, strategies, and tactics. For over 25 years, to be specific, for 26 years now, the primary goal of the open education movement has been to increase access to educational opportunity. That's been the goal. And our primary strategy for accomplishing that goal is to increase access to educational materials. Now, of course, there's more to educational opportunity than just materials, but it's hard to scale access to people. So the primary strategy of the movement has been to increase access to materials, to resources. And of course, the primary tactic there has been creating and sharing OER. So just with that stake in the ground, let me talk about origins for a second. Everyone has their own story of how they came in to this work, and yours will be different from mine. I'm just going to tell mine just to give you a little background about me and where I'm coming from and how I came into this. In 1998, I was working as the webmaster at Marshall University here in West Virginia. Marshall is my alma mater. And I had this realization, and I was not the first person to realize it. Lots of people had figured this out before me. Economists even have technical terms for what I'm about to describe. But I had the realization in a way that was personal to me, that there's a really important difference between resources that are physical and resources that are digital. And by that, I mean, if my wife is sitting across the table from me and is reading a copy of the newspaper, I can't read that same copy of the newspaper until she's done. That physical resource is something that we have to compete for access to. But if I take that same news and instead of printing it on the page, I make it digital and I make it available over the internet, now 1 million people can access it all at the same time. And this is something that's so fundamentally different, this affordance of digital materials. Maybe another example would be thinking about Blockbuster and YouTube. Imagine going to YouTube to watch a video and seeing a message that says, "I'm sorry, someone else is watching this video right now. You'll have to wait until they're done." It's just kind of unthinkable. This affordance of digital resources that we can all have simultaneous access to them makes them very different from physical resources. Now, lots of people were figuring this out at this same time, right? Those of you who are old enough will remember Napster. Napster figured out that we can take physical CDs of music and then we can make digital copies of the songs there. And once they're digital, then we can share them online for free, and lots of people can all grab them and use them and listen to them at the same time. So lots of people were leveraging this realization about this different nature of digital materials. But what we all learned very quickly was just because sharing was possible via the internet didn't mean it was legal. And of course, the record labels came for Napster, et cetera, et cetera. Part of what puts us in this bind is copyright law. As of, you can go read about the Berne Convention here in Wikipedia. This is a screenshot from Wikipedia. But when the US became a signatory to the Berne Convention, everything in copyright world in the United States flipped upside down. Before this happened, if you wanted to protect something that you had created, you registered the copyright for it. And if you didn't want to protect it, you weren't ever going to commercialize it, et cetera, you didn't register the copyright for it, and you didn't have a copyright on it. When the US became a signatory to Berne, that flipped upside down so that from the moment you create any creative work, it's automatically copyrighted to the full extent of the law, so that a crayon drawing that you would make is copyrighted with equal power and strength as the Harry Potter franchise of books. Every creative work is immediately copyrighted. Now, how does that fit in here? We have this amazing technology, the internet, that will let us share anything in terms of the technical capability, but every single thing we create is automatically copyrighted, whether we wanted that copyright or not. How are we supposed to share things with each other via this amazing new technology when copyright is getting in the way? So in 1998, I was learning about the open source software movement and thought, what if we took this idea from open source software of creating open licenses that expressed the permissions that people had, and we applied that same idea to educational materials? Then we could start doing the kind of sharing that the internet empowers us to do. And so from, there's an early burst of activity around 1998 around the creation of these open licenses. So first, the Open Content Principles and License I published in 98. Then I collaborated with Eric Raymond on the open publication license in '99, which lots of material is published under the open publication license. The first version of the Creative Commons licenses came out in 2002. And you can look in, when I share the slides, if you're interested in the history of the kind of evolution of open licenses for content or open licenses for things that aren't software, you can explore that a little more. But the important thing to know about open licenses is that what the internet had made technically possible in terms of all the sharing that it enabled, open licenses made legal. We could tell people, yes, I know I have a copyright on this. I didn't ask for it. I didn't even necessarily want it. But via this open license, I'm telling you, you can make copies, you can make changes, you can do all the things that you need to do. And now 26 years later, over 2.5 billion works have been licensed under a Creative Commons license. Just thinking about Lumen and our work, our open educational resources have over 1 billion page views, and over 2.3 million students have used our OER courseware as their required course materials. When you think about that and the impact of all the work that everyone else has done, MIT OpenCourseware, OpenStax, we've come a very long way in 26 years. And from the Open Syllabus Project here, this quote from a 2023 publication of theirs, that in 2013, it's like 10 years ago when they were writing, OER textbooks were just barely on the scene. They're only used in about 1 in 400 classes, but 10 years later, that number was 1 in 80. So OER adoption in US higher ed really has been growing pretty significantly. So if we think about this in terms of, I'm interested in this idea of the most powerful emerging technology. So at the beginning of the open education movement, we were in what most people describe as an information age. And that was a time that was characterized by the most powerful emerging technology, the internet, making it possible for us to make and transmit copies of educational resources almost instantaneously and at almost no cost. You could send a copy of a PDF around the globe in milliseconds for fractions of a penny, right? And in this context, in the context of the most powerful emerging technology being the internet, it makes sense that creating and sharing OER is what we would do. That was the optimal way to increase access to educational resources. But now it feels like we're starting to transition from an information age to something like a generative age, when the most powerful emerging technology isn't the internet anymore. It's generative AI. And generative AI is a resource where you can just create new resources on demand, rather than, in the case of the internet, I could immediately make perfect copies and I can immediately send them anywhere, which was a capability we'd never had before. But with generative AI, I can just ask for a resource that doesn't exist and get it ordered to spec. Get it on specific topic, using specific examples, using specific pedagogies, with specific approaches to practice and feedback, in a specific language, etc. So if the most powerful emerging technology is now generative AI, what does that mean for us? I just want to dive a little bit into, as a way of setting up the answer to this question. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Drake equation, but this is just a really fun, it's not meant to be an actual equation where you plug in specific numbers and get a specific answer out the other side. But the Drake equation is just this kind of way of thinking about how likely is it that we might be able to communicate with another species somewhere else in the Milky Way. And so you can see it kind of filters down here from top to bottom, where you think about the average rate of star formation and how many of those stars will have planets and how many of those planets will be habitable and how many of those habitable planets actually developed life and then how much of that life became. You can see it kind of works down this funnel to give us a sense of what's the likelihood that we might eventually be able to communicate with another civilization out there. I think there's a similar kind of Drake equation for OER. So imagine that you need an educational resource on a specific topic. So first, you have to hope that someone else out there in the world somewhere has already created that resource that you need. Then you have to hope that they've openly licensed it. Then you have to hope that that openly licensed resource has been published somewhere where Google can find it and index it, or that it's gone into a repository. Then you have to hope that Google actually did index it, or that you're able to make your way somehow to that repository. And finally, you have to hope that all of your searching will actually end up in you locating the resource. So it's this kind of funnel down again from once you realize you need OER, there's quite a bit of things, quite a bit of stuff that has to come together for you to find that open educational resource that you're looking for. Compare that with generative AI. When you need an educational resource on a specific topic, you describe what you need to generative AI and it creates it for you. Now, will that resource need to be checked for accuracy, etc.? Yes, of course. But I hope you're also checking the OER created by random strangers who you don't know when you go out and find one and you're about to assign it to your students. I hope that you're checking it for accuracy and doing those same kinds of things as well. But this is a very different paradigm between all the things that have to come together for you to find OER and the way that generative AI works. So let me pivot for a minute and talk about this, this kind of mantra that we have in entrepreneurship that is fall in love with your problem and not your solution. And again, I'm leading us into this conversation about OER, but stay with me on this mantra here for a moment. Fall in love with your problem, not your solution. Way back in the day, people had a problem, and the problem was they need a way to keep their food and their drinks and some other items cold. And the solution was we will go out to frozen lakes, we will cut and harvest giant blocks of ice from those lakes, and we'll deliver it to our customers' homes. And that solution solved the problem. It met the need at that time. Fast forward a few years, that problem remains the same. I still need a way to keep food and drinks and other items cold. But technology enabled a new solution to that problem, which was industrial ice making. We could make ice in giant factories and make it much closer to where people live and deliver it to their homes that way. I didn't have to go to a frozen lake and cut it out and harvest it anymore. And then finally, as technology continued to evolve, I still needed a way to keep my food and drinks and other stuff cold. But that refrigeration technology that was actually being used in the big manufactories where they were making ice and storing it before they shipped it to me, that technology became affordable enough that I could have a refrigerator and a freezer in my own home. And now I don't need any ice delivered to my home anymore. I have a way of keeping things cold at home myself. So this idea of falling in love with your problem and not your solution is really important during these times of kind of technological advances, because the problem will stay the same, but the best available solution will change over time. And if you fall in love with your problem, if you're really interested in solving that problem of helping people keep their food and drinks and other things cold, then as new technologies come available, you'll adopt them and you'll use them to help people keep their things cold even more effectively, more cost effectively, more efficiently, etc. But if instead of being in love with the problem, you're actually in love with your solution, then that can be difficult because you're eventually going to get left behind. The people who are making ice in factories and then delivering that out to people's homes, if they couldn't make that transition to in-home refrigeration, they just got left behind. So I think about this and I worry about the field, those of us who are working in OER a lot from this perspective, right? Our problem is that the problem we're trying to tackle is inequitable access to educational opportunity out in the world. So we've said we have this goal of increasing access to educational opportunity, and we have a strategy for doing that. But if you think about where generative AI comes into this conversation now, generative AI has the potential to provide dramatically more resources on more topics in more languages and more formats than our current approach, which is every time I need an OER, I sit down and by hand, through some bespoke process, I craft this individual OER. That's the way we've done it up until now because there was no other choice. There wasn't another way for us to do that. But if generative AI really does have this kind of capability, then it may be that the optimal tactic or the best current solution for accomplishing our primary goal of increasing access to educational materials and educational opportunity is to use generative AI. So I think a group of people, in which I would include myself, whose primary goal is to increase access to educational opportunity by increasing access to educational materials, should begin shifting their focus from what I'll call traditional OER in a minute and start thinking about generative AI. Now, does that mean that OER is not going to have a role to play in the future? Well, obviously, OER is going to continue to have a role to play, just like printed textbooks in some places still continue to play a role. But that role, the role of printed textbooks, is certainly decreasing over time. The role of OER will continue to decrease over time as well. So let's be more specific about what the impact is going to be here. You've probably seen the definition of OER at the top of the screen here. This is the Creative Commons definition, the Hewlett Foundation definition, and you probably know Hewlett funds more work in OER than any other funder. But teaching, learning, and research materials that either reside in the public domain or have been released under an open license that permits their free use and repurposing by others. This is what, since 2002, 2003, since the phrase open educational resources was invented, this is what people have imagined when they've heard the words OER: articles, chapters, essays, textbooks, images, videos, things like this. When we think about the impact of generative AI on these traditional OER, there's a profound effect on the way that these might be authored, as well as the way that they might be revised and remixed. So before generative AI existed, as I was saying a minute ago, when we sat down to create OER, the only choice we had was just to do it, kind of brute force, by hand. So everything was kind of handcrafted during that period. But now for the last year or so, we've been in this kind of emerging new phase with generative AI, where traditional OER can be AI drafted. You can get to that first draft in hours rather than weeks or months. And you still need to go through the process of peer review and editorial. All the things that need to happen to a first draft still need to happen in the world of generative AI. But that first draft can happen so much more rapidly now. You can save yourself an order of magnitude of time, at least, by which I mean take the amount of time it used to take and divide by 10, right? So it seems to me that as we think about the path forward, that philanthropists, foundations, funders, maybe governments, people that want to be effective stewards of funding, I think are likely going to begin requiring people who are working with OER to talk about how they're using generative AI to do that kind of traditional OER work more efficiently and effectively. So that's authoring OER, but what about revising and remixing? So again, open licenses make it legal for us to revise and remix educational materials, but open licenses don't magically grant me the skill and expertise that I need to, say, translate a resource into Spanish or into Mandarin. That's a kind of revise and remix that is in very high demand around the world. Open licenses give me permission to do it, but they don't give me the expertise to be able to do it. Or creating a certain kind of interactive resource based on static resources, or adjusting the level, the reading level of a text from its current level to kind of exactly another level. Just because open licenses give us these permissions, they don't give us the skills that we need. If you've hung around the OER community long enough, you've probably heard these ideas of Berlin's two kinds of liberty. Negative liberty being the freedom from interference, freedom from obstacles, freedom from barriers. Negative liberty is the idea that there's nothing standing in my way, preventing me from doing what I want to do. Positive liberty, on the other hand, is actually having the capability and the skill and actually having what I need to go and do the thing that I want to do. So negative liberty and positive liberty, closely related, but slightly different. And clearly, open licenses remove the obstacles and barriers related to copyright law with regard to how we can interact with educational resources. So Open licenses greatly increase our negative liberty, right? But they don't give us those skills and expertise that we need to engage in revise and remix necessarily. So that leaves a deficit of positive liberty. The thing that's interesting here is that generative AI gives all of us access to more kind of positive liberty with regard to OER by making it so I can at least get a draft of that Spanish translation out, or I can at least get out a draft of that interactive thing that I wanted to create. Things that I could never do on my own, just based on my own skills and expertise, I can do when I'm able to work with generative AI. So that means I can do more revising and remixing of traditional OER now than I could in the past. Research has shown, and this is, John Hilton was my graduate student back in the day. He's gone on to become a great researcher in OER and other topics now, but a dozen years ago now, some research that we did showed that the more time and effort are required to engage in a specific kind of revise and remix activity, the less often users will engage in that activity. Specifically, we were looking in a database of open textbooks that had a layer of functionality on top of it that made it possible for faculty to directly engage in the revise and remix process. And we could see all of that happening. And what you saw is for revise and remixes that took like a single click or a single drag. So say I'm going to delete a chapter, or I'm going to take this chapter and move it up before that chapter. That kind of revise and remix happened fairly frequently. But revise and remix that took a lot more time, like going and finding a chapter from a different book and importing it into this one, or opening up a chapter and writing a new example to go into the middle of that chapter, those kinds of activities happen a lot less often. People are more likely to do things that are easier and faster. So, in as much as that's true, if generative AI makes a lot of tasks faster and easier, we should expect to see an increase in revising and remixing of OER in the future as people use generative AI to do that. And if you've been following the research on generative AI, there have been several studies showing that the productivity gains associated with using generative AI are the highest among the people who have the lowest skill levels in the work that they're trying to do. And that should make total sense, right? Generative AI would be a lot more helpful to me translating something into Spanish, which is a language that I don't speak, than it would be translating something into Japanese, which is a language that I do. Right? So not only should we see an increase in revise and remix activity, but the quality of the revising and remixing that happens now with traditional OER should also increase as people begin using generative AI to engage in those activities. So let me pivot and talk for a couple minutes about what I'm calling generative OER. Maybe there will be a better name for it, but this is what I've been calling it in my thinking and writing. These are not OER that are designed to be used directly by students or directly by faculty in support of their teaching and learning, but they're OER that are meant to be used to create other OER. So specifically, I'm thinking about openly licensed prompts and openly licensed model weights. So let's say a word about those. Many of the prompts that are written by first-time generative AI users are pretty simple, like write me a poem about rainy days. Write me a poem about rainy days is not copyrightable. But the kinds of prompts that you write when you're trying to elicit more kind of complicated, more nuanced behavior from a model can easily be hundreds or thousands of words long. And at that point, you've written something now that is copyrightable. Thank you, Berne convention. If it is copyrightable, it will be automatically copyrighted. Meaning that if you want to be sharing these more sophisticated prompts that elicit more complex behavior from models with each other, and doing that in a way that is very clearly legal, where other people have permission to revise and remix and make changes to them, we have to openly license our prompts. And so openly licensed prompts would be one form of this kind of generative OER that I'm talking about. And the reason that open prompts, well, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons why open prompts matter is that we've understood for a long time with traditional OER, part of what's powerful about being able to revise and remix is that when I take an OER written somewhere else and I want to use it with my students, I likely need to make changes to it so that it is a better fit for them culturally, linguistically, however. It doesn't feel like it, in my case now, where in West Virginia, it doesn't feel like it's coming from, you know, the big city and feel completely out of place to the students that I would work with here at Marshall, but make it feel like it's Appalachian, like it would make sense and be recognizable and feel relevant to them. For all those same reasons, open prompts need to be revisable and remixable. And also because as you take the same prompt from model to model, different models respond to different prompts in different ways. So maybe you've really optimized your model for ChatGPT, but maybe on my campus, we have an enterprise deal with Anthropic and everyone is using Claude. Well, I'm going to need to tweak that prompt a little bit if it's going to work for my students. So I need permission to revise and remix. So again, openly licensing prompts becomes really important. Open weights. And I'm there, for those of you who are following this closely, there's a big debate about what constitutes an open source AI model writ large. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm not interested in that. I just want to talk about model weights. And model weights, if you do any statistics, are conceptually similar to the beta weights in a linear regression. A weight is a number, like minus 0.78, you know, whatever on the screen there. When we say model weights, we're talking about the dozens or hundreds of matrices that store the millions or billions of these individual numbers. And those matrices collectively are what comprise a generative AI model, right? So if you take those matrices of numbers and you openly license them so that people can download those, revise, remix, reuse, redistribute them, that's what I mean by a generative AI model that has open weights. Now, open weights matter for a bunch of reasons too. First, you've used ChatGPT. It's not designed to behave pedagogically. When you ask it a question, it doesn't say, well, you know, let's think about that and break it down, or let me give you a hint first. It just answers your question, right? It doesn't behave in a pedagogical manner at all. And these models also frequently lack the kind of disciplinary knowledge or cultural knowledge that is needed in certain learning situations. So there are techniques we can use from prompt engineering or from RAG to temporarily improve a model's knowledge or behavior. But if you want to permanently change the behavior of a generative AI model, you have to fine-tune the model. And that means you're going to take some additional data, some data that you've specifically curated. Maybe you're trying to get this model to behave more like a tutor. And so what you might do is you might go get 10,000 examples of conversations between a human tutor and a student. And you might label some of them as being really effective and label others of them as being really poor. And then show all of those examples to the model in a way that will permanently change its behavior. That's what fine-tuning is about. It's about actually changing the model itself permanently. And I'm going to skip over some of this more technical stuff because we're running short on time. But when you have permission to engage in the 5R activities, then there's a whole bunch of techniques available to us that we can use to take an open weights model and permanently change its behavior. You can also make them much smaller so that they can run on your laptop or on your smartphone without being connected to the internet. And I'll show an example of this in a second. But permission to download, own, revise, remix, etc., these smaller, customized, optimized open weights models, I think this is really key to using generative AI to improve equity and access to educational opportunity. When you can download something like ChatGPT, just like an app, when you can download it onto your phone, put your phone in airplane mode so you're not connected to the internet at all, and still chat with that Gen AI locally without any of your data going out into the cloud, that improves privacy, decreases energy consumption. It deals with a lot of the issues and concerns that people have about generative AI. And because we're able, as we fine-tune these open weights models, we can permanently change their behavior in ways that we care about. It means we can also increase the likelihood of improving learning outcomes for students. There's a bunch of examples here. I would just call your attention to the one at the top here, LM Studio. If you're interested in downloading a generative AI model and running it locally on your own machine without any internet connection, LM Studio, I think, is the easiest way to do that. It'll just, if you're like me, it'll just blow your mind that you'll download a file. It'll be a big file, 2 or 3 gigs, 4 or 5 gigs. It'll be a big file, but once you've downloaded it, you can chat, it'll generate answers, answer your questions, do all the things that like ChatGPT would do, but it will do it running locally on your own machine. So let's just say something quickly about what happens to our pedagogy. In the past, we've talked about OER-enabled pedagogy, which is the set of teaching and learning practices, the things that you want to do in teaching and learning that are only possible or practical when you have permission to engage in the 5R activities, or as I've summarized here in the blue, things you can do with OER that you can't do otherwise. So for example, working with your students to edit and rewrite your textbook. Can't do that with traditionally copyrighted materials. You can only do it with OER. I think there will be something similar that will be like Gen AI enabled pedagogy, the things you can do with generative AI that you can't do otherwise. So as an example here at the bottom, we typically don't assign synchronous collaborative activities like think, pair, share in fully asynchronous online courses because students don't want to have to get together with each other at specific times. That's why they took an asynchronous course. But when generative AI can play the role of the partner in the think, pair, share, now you can assign that kind of synchronous collaborative activity in a fully asynchronous online course. That's something that you couldn't do before, but now you can because of generative AI. And we'll find more examples of that. Let me skip ahead here just to close. How the movement will change, or how at least it should change. If we're truly in love with our problem, if we're really trying to solve this issue of inequitable access to educational opportunity, and we're not just obsessed with our solution, which for the last quarter century has been traditional OER, then general OER have this capability to dramatically improve the things that we say we care about improving. Now, the change from working with traditional OER and a WYSIWYG tool like Pressbooks to working with open prompts and open weights, there's definitely a level of technical difficulty that comes with that. It's like the difference between working with just HTML and CSS to working with JavaScript and databases and APIs. It's more technical, but it's undeniably more powerful as well in terms of its potential. I'm worried as a movement that we won't change, or will be very delayed in making this change in where we're focusing our thinking, because we may have confused the means with the end, or we might have prioritized the tactic over the goal. I think there are some places from where I sit, from my perspective, it looks like there are some places where the goal is no longer increasing access to educational opportunity. The goal is making sure people adopt OER. And if that's become the goal, then that's going to significantly delay adopting, the most powerful emerging technology, which is going to cost our students opportunities. So I just want to plant this little idea in your brain. As you think about the most interesting OER repositories in the world, I'd suggest to you that ChatGPT is an OER repository. You don't search it for pre-existing things, but you ask it for things you need and it delivers resources to you. So think about that idea, that ChatGPT is an OER repository. And we've got less than a minute. Let me close with a call to action. Emotionally, it's hard to leave behind or think about moving on from traditional OER as the primary tactic. At least for me, it's consumed 26 years of my professional life. But I think we owe it to students to use the best tools available to increase their access to and the effectiveness of their educational opportunity. So my invitation to you is to begin thinking about generative OER and what role it might play in your teaching. Thank you. We've got less than a minute, but I'm happy to sneak in a question and an answer if someone has.
Thank you, David. And we can go a few extra minutes. We actually have a break built in after this to catch up sessions. So if you wouldn't mind sharing some of the resources we saw on a couple of your slides, maybe your favorites or the most relevant to this conversation.
Yeah, I'll just share the slides in the chat here.
Oh, that would be ideal.
Like I said, it's an OER. There we are. Questions or comments or pushback or criticism or anything at all? Thank you, Julia.
Can I just say my question? I can't type it.
That's great.
I can't even think of how to phrase it. This was awesome. I found myself thinking about copyright in here because we've talked all this about open licenses. And we're still working out the copyright issue for AI, right? And how fair use is going to help or not help some of what you're talking about with the prompts and the open prompts. And at what point do we have to open license something because it's not just fair use, right? So that I just had all these different things coming in my head. I don't know if you can comment anywhere on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can only comment on what has already happened, which is that multiple times now, the U.S. Copyright Office has had the chance to weigh in on whether, for example, are the outputs of generative AI models copyrightable or not? And they have consistently said that those outputs are not copyrightable, which is why I say that ChatGPT is an OER repository. Everything it creates is in the public domain. It's not copyrighted. And OER are things that give you permission to engage in the 5R activities, whether they are in the public domain or released under an open license. So from that perspective, there's been good consistency about kind of generative AI with regard to copyright. The big question that's still outstanding, to my mind, is whether training a generative AI model is a fair use activity or not. If it is a fair use, then regardless of whether your material is fully copyrighted or openly licensed or licensed Creative Commons with a non-commercial, it doesn't matter. Because when an activity is a fair use, it happens outside the boundary of copyright. It's an activity that's exempt from copyright. So if training models really is a fair use, which I think it is, I think that's where the law will end up. Then that's very interesting. If it turns out that it's not a fair use and you have to go and clear permissions for every individual resource that you would want to use in training, then that will also be very interesting. But there hasn't been, neither Congress nor the courts have kind of tipped their hand yet, have given us any hint of what the answer to that question is going to be. Although there's some really good work happening in law review journals, at least that I've been following, that are making the argument pretty strongly that training a model is a fair use. So I don't know if that's getting to any of what you were asking. And I couldn't see your name either. I apologize when you were speaking. So I don't even know who you were. Will you pop back on and say your name?
My name's Julia Rodriguez. Sorry, I can't.
Oh, it's Julia. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's all those things about fair use that I've been hearing, and I took the Harvard copyright class last year and talking about is this fair use, which I think lots of us in this room would like it to be, right? So I just was wondering if you had heard more. But
yeah, not yet.
Any other questions for David? David, you're getting kudos in the chat.
Just drop my email in the chat again. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Nobody wants to argue. I mean, I love everyone saying that you enjoyed the presentation, but no pushback at all. Corey.
I want to put a plug in our keynote. Jenny Rose Halperin, her presentation will also be not about AI, but about digital ownership, copyright, a lot of the same things David was hitting on today. So if this was intriguing to you, I think her presentation will also be.
Awesome.
And it looks like you're already making people reevaluate their approach to teaching. So that's fabulous.
Well, yeah, if that's all that happened today, then I think we'd all feel like it was a really big success. I was full-time. I was full-time faculty for a dozen years before we started Lumen, and so I've done, I taught as an adjunct at community college all the way up to teaching at a R1. So I've kind of done all of it on the teaching side. And it's just so easy to get into your established routine and, what works for you. And it worked pretty well last semester. So I don't have any more time this semester than I did last time. So I'm just going to kind of keep going with what's working. It takes a pretty big system shock to make you step back and really reevaluate a lot of what you're doing. And on the one hand, those are really frightening, but I also think they're just so valuable. And because otherwise we're so unlikely to step all the way back and do the kind of reevaluation that we would benefit from doing.
Hey, if there aren't any more questions or arguments for David,